very modern controversy. The church knew that the relationship was through James's relationship to Jesus was through Joseph for its entire history, not just up to the Reformation, but through the Reformation, and it only started to be contested in the 1700s. And that was by people who didn't even believe Jesus existed.
Yeah.
So remember those historical critical people we saw with Bruno Bauer and that whole group? We saw that on the documentary a couple times. They talked about how in the 1700s people started raising all these crazy doubts and questions. Well, that was one of the things they raised up. And of course that really got accentuated by the sexual revolution of the 60s, where we couldn't believe anybody could survive life without having sex, when it was a fairly normal thing for a segment of society, at least throughout all of history. Most cultures have had a segment of their society that was dedicated to forever being abstinent for one reason or another. There were lots of different cultural reasons for that, and that's true cross-culturally. It was just in the wake of the sexual revolution, certain people couldn't believe that anyone could do that. But anyhow.
Well, was Jude also a half-brother?
Jude, it's a good question. I don't think so. I don't believe that was ever part of what was passed on. He was one of the inner circle, though. He was part of that group, a lot like Mark and Luke, right? So, and of course Jude would have been such a common name because it's the shortened form of Judah.
Yeah.
So anytime you get one of the 12 tribes, you're bound to get tons of people with that name. So I just became familiar with one of those pieces of extra-canonical literature that we sometimes call Apocrypha. One's called the Testimonies of the 12 Patriarchs. And it's obviously doesn't belong in Scripture, but it's an insight into the ways that the Jewish people of Jesus' day, because it was a popular piece of literature around the time of Jesus, it was somebody imagining what the 12 brothers would have said as they did. Because, of course, we know, in fact, it may be our reading today for chapel time. I saw it's one of our upcoming readings where you get that sort of, Jesse is saying, this is Joshua saying, I set before you life and death and this kind of stuff, right? Saying that on behalf of the Lord. And he's saying, as for me and my house, we choose life, right? We choose the way of God. Well, of course, as we're going to see, as you see the end of the story of Joseph, he's going to pronounce blessing. That the father of Joseph is going to pronounce blessings and curses, right, upon not Jesse. Jacob is going to pronounce blessings and curses upon his 12 sons as his sort of dying reflection. Or his dying thing, just like we had Abraham, or not Abraham. Abraham pronouncing the blessing over Isaac and Esau, right? That he can't give the blessing a second time because he's already given it to Isaac. You're going to see Jacob doing the exact same thing over his children as the book of Genesis comes to a close. Well, this is the reflection. This is like Jewish imagining, a pious imagining of what would the 12 brothers have responded to this. I haven't read it yet, so I'm interested to take a look at it and see. Because again, it's almost kind of like, it'd be like the equivalent in the modern world of something like The Shack or Jesus Calling, where they're imagining what, in Jesus Calling, here's what I would imagine Jesus would say about these things in my life that he didn't actually say anything about, And The Shack, if I encountered the Trinity today, what would it feel like? Especially in the wake of a big tragedy? It's this kind of literature that was very popular. But it also served as a commentary upon the scriptures, which is interesting. So I mentioned to you that at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book we have the most copies of is Genesis. The second book we have the most copies of is Enoch. And there's a whole set of Jewish commentaries or Jewish literature called the Enochic literature. That's all from that same time period that Enoch was written, so it reflects the Jewish mindset at a certain point. Well, they obviously thought this was a very important book because they had so many copies of it, which meant that essentially what it meant was that you need to have a lot of copies in the library so lots of people could take it out at the same time. And then Jubilees was the next one after that, and both Enoch and Jubilees are commentaries on Genesis. So we're getting extended commentaries on what the Jews of Jesus' day thought about the book of Genesis. Which is very interesting. That all three of those books we have more copies of than Exodus, which is where you get the Ten Commandments. Or Deuteronomy, for that matter, which is the book of the Old Testament that Jesus quotes the most. So you get this very different perspective on what was important to that group of Jews who lived at Qumran. So, prayer requests as we begin.
But you had one. I thought you had one last week.
Prayer request. No.
Oh, not prayer request.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just pray for the world because clearly it needs it. Yes.
That my memory won't get worse.
Okay. Sounds cool. We'll definitely do that.
You
Lord,
pray
we
for all of us for that.
Yes, amen and amen. Yes, I'll tell you something I just heard, which I thought was fun. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be together around your word. We lift to you our failing faculties, especially remembering Vanetta's memory. But Lord, we know that all things in this life pass, and you alone are eternal. So we entrust ourselves to you. Blessed be with us in the midst of this world that is passing away. Sustain our faith and remind us that the time is coming when all things will truly be made new, that the broken will be mended, that which has been taken away will be restored, and even more than restored. Bless us as we come to your word this day, that it may enlighten us for our journey and teach us the truths which are yours alone. We ask it in the precious name of our Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
So as we head into this, I just want a final commentary, because I know you want to start us with a question, because you said you have a question. But as we wrapped up that section, and I don't want to go back and revisit it unless you guys have questions, about that sort of the struggle between God and the demons, and that turns into the struggle between God's people and the giant clans, which are the demons' people. That when we get to Easter next year, recognize that this is the culmination of that war. That's the decisive, victorious battle. And all that's left now is the mopping up. Okay, the same way that the American Civil War turned decisively at Gettysburg, and really the Confederacy never got the upper hand again. It never was winning the war again. It's the same way. Jesus has struck the decisive blow for God against his enemies, but we're in the mopping up thing. And so we who still experience the afflictions of the demons wish that this period would end. But we know that the war will end in only one way now. That this isn't a war which could go either direction. So we should be encouraged in the middle of our struggles as we face the inevitable difficulties of this life.
To know that the devil does not have the upper hand.
That's right.
As afflicted as we feel.
Yes, exactly. And I got fascinated by that history, I think, as I started to learn it, not just because it's a part of the story I never understood before, despite the fact that I'd gone to seminary and everything else, but also because one of the things I've persistently struggled with in my ministry is how to get young men engaged in the church, right? Mm-hmm. You look around and women outnumber men 2-1, and have for the last 150 years in the life of the church. But we need our young men engaged too. The women need our young men engaged in their faith. And so, men are drawn towards battle stories, and men are drawn towards a call to be heroic, right? And I do think that that's the kind of thing that knowing that we're still in the mop-up, that there's still heroism required of us and stuff, is something that I think appeals to young men as well as young women. I don't think women that doesn't appeal to them, but they're drawn in by other things as well. I think the men are less drawn in by the soft imagery rather than the call to be a hero. But we are called to be a hero in a particular way. We can't just be strong. We have to be strong, and that needs to be tempered by gentleness and love and this kind of stuff. So I think there's a learning curve for men, but they need to capture the fact that we're not being called to give away our manhood to enter the church. It's a different kind of thing. And I think this, to see Jesus as a warrior is a helpful thing. There's lots of pictures of Jesus like that, where he looks very gentle and inviting, and that's good. We want that too. But we've lost that sense that he's our commander in chief, which I think appeals to young men as well. So that's one of the reasons why I got interested in it. But to know that he's a warrior is also a good thing when we're feeling oppressed and beaten down. We feel like the enemy's winning, to know he can't win. There's no possible way for him to win. And like I said in my sermon on Sunday, this is that when he talks about binding the strong man so you may plunder his house, it's God plundering the house of Satan. He was given the realm of death. So he was in Genesis 3, he's reduced to only being God of the dead. It's the only thing he has any power over are the dead, and now even that's being taken away from him in the victory of Christ. So it's a good thing to know that he's on the rear foot. You know?
Some days it doesn't seem like
It does not feel like that all the
Yes,
time, no.
exactly.
And in fact, if I'm reading, if I understand Revelation correctly, and I say it that way because it's a notoriously hard book to understand
Absolutely.
completely.
Wasn't meant to be understood, was it?
Well, I think it was.
It was?
It was, yeah. It wasn't meant to be understood by the church's enemies, but it couldn't be understood by the church's enemies because they wouldn't be familiar with all the imagery, right? If you understand the Old Testament, the imagery is pretty straightforward, which is one of the reasons I'm teaching my Revelation class again on Wednesday nights. But it is, at least the outlines are meant to be understood. I don't think it's necessarily meant to be understood as a timeline of here's how the end times will go down. It is a reassurance for us that God is going to win the final victory. And that's important because if you read most of the middle chapters, it looks like it's going against God's people. I mean, the war is going to it's going to look like it's getting worse before it gets better in the end times. If I understand Revelation correctly, that's what we should get out of it. That there's going to be a time where we have to endure and be faithful in spite of it looks like we're losing before the end times. So, that said, I think that there have been a lot of Christians throughout history who've needed that encouragement. I think of, is it Anne? Who was, anyway, Augustine's mother. It starts with an A. Her name starts with an A. I think it was Anne. That she prayed for 27 years for the conversion of her son. When he was lost in not just crazy pagan philosophy, but lots of, what's the word I want to look for? Dissipated sexual practice. I mean, he was basically what we would call an addict to that kind of behavior in this day and age. She's praying, hope against hope for my son, and her prayer was answered, and he became the most important Christian voice in history.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it is. But I thought to myself, what is the faithfulness it takes to pray for 27 years when you're seeing no results? That's awesome. So she's an inspiration to me. So I think that's good for us. And of course, the story of Joseph's going to be that story, right? It's going to be this story of long faithfulness in Joseph when one thing after another goes wrong. And every time it seems like it's getting better, it gets worse. He gets these it almost feels like he's being teased, like, oh, things are going to improve, and then it all collapses, right? And you see this over and over again. So I think that's one of the reasons why, and of course that's our Lord's story too. He ultimately has to go through the crucifixion in order to be enthroned at his Father's right hand.
And he knew it was coming.
Yes.
Through his whole life, he knew it was coming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, yes. And it's funny, you're talking about, I wonder if he knew his whole life. It's a mystery. Theologians have thought about this a lot for 2,000 years. How did he grow from infanthood and what that would mean? He needs to learn the language of...
But the glimpses that
the Bible gives us. Right.
Kind of indicates.
Yes.
That.
Well, and but the glimpses it gives us are of his, basically we would think of his bar mitzvah, right? He's about 12 or 14, he's left in the temple, and then he's an adult. So there's a lot of years in there that aren't covered. So theologians have thought about, obviously in his godhood he would know everything, that never stops. In his personhood, we have that tantalizing language from Philippians that he emptied himself and took on the form of a slave or a servant, depending on how you translate the word. meaning he gave up every prerogative. So in his humanity, did he know everything he knew in his godhood? Or did he have to grow into that? I'm sure he grew up with the stories of being the son of God, and mom and dad are telling him the stories, or Joseph and Mary are telling him the stories. And I'm sure that the Holy Spirit is working to enlighten the scriptures for him when he goes to worship. Remember, they probably didn't have their own copy of the scriptures at home, right? He only knows the scriptures when he goes to worship and hears them read out like everyone else. Private copies of the Torah simply were too expensive for an impoverished person like a carpenter to own. He's getting these realizations. I think to myself of that moment that comes as you're becoming an adult and you realize something you didn't realize as a kid. When did he come to that realization? Did he know it from the time he was essentially a child? Or did he come at some point in his teens, or maybe his adulthood, as the pieces are coming together for him to go, this means I'm going to have to die. And I'm going to have to die in some horrible way. And or when did that, and he's still, that faithfulness that followed. And I'm imagining, because clearly he understands it by the time he's an adult doing his public ministry. So he enters his public ministry knowing how it will end. And that's just amazing to me, that the faithfulness that entails. So
When Mary and Joseph lost him, how did he answer the question? How you know where I'd be with my father's house?
right. So he had a clear sense of who he was,
right,
by that 12 or 14 or whatever it was, right? But did he know that would mean he was going to die in the most horrible of ways? No. I don't know. I don't know. Again, theologians have debated this for 2,000 years, and we're not going to settle it.
Exactly.
But it's worth thinking.
I hope he didn't figure that out until very, very late for his own sanity.
On the other hand, that he still faithfully entered into the ministry, knowing that's how it would end, is something that inspires me as well. Because of course, the first thing you see when he gets baptized, right, which is really the first public act of his ministry, it's his commissioning ceremony, or his public commitment to what he's doing. Immediately, we're told the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness. Well, again, for a Jew of the Second Temple period, they know what the wilderness is. It's the place that on the day of Yom Kippur, you send the goat that's dedicated to Azazel, right? That when we saw the two goats that you see on the Day of Atonement, one goes to Yahweh. That's the perfect one.
Right.
You place all the sins of the people on Azazel and send him back to his master. All the sins came from Azazel in the first place. We're going to send it back to Azazel. So they know, when any Jew reading the Gospels, the minute they say the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, like, oh, this is going to get ugly. And it does. That's where you get this wrestling between Jesus and Satan, right? In 3 of our 4 Gospels, we get that story. But again, any Jew of the Second Temple period would have known instantly what it meant that he was going to the wilderness. And some of that is going to come from the fact that what happens to Joseph. I mean, again, Joseph's life is going to be considered by the early Christians to be the most perfect prefiguring of Christ in the Old Testament. There's lots of great passages like Isaiah 53 with the suffering servant, and there's predictions like that we see quoted for us in the Gospels. But as a story, Joseph's story is going to look just like Jesus' story. The preferred son, who's going to be rejected by his own people, driven into the wilderness, sold into slavery. And I've often wondered whether that, again, scholars are pretty well agreed that Paul is quoting a hymn in Philippians 2 when he says, that language of Christ emptied himself and took the form of a servant or slave. It's the word doulos in Greek. It means either servant or slave, depending on context. You always have to get it from context, and it's impossible to tell from the context there because he's just quoting a hymn. Well, did that language of taking the form of a slave come from those early Christians going, this sounds like the story of Joseph and he was sold into slavery? We don't know. There's no way to know. But if Paul's already quoting a hymn about 15 years after the resurrection, that hymn was composed really quickly. Somebody in the early church is writing that hymn, and everyone's singing it because it makes sense to them. And I wonder if it made sense because of this story that we're about to spend the rest of Genesis getting into here. So, listen.
Which it leads to my question.
All right, let's hear the question.
The disciples were with Jesus for years,
Mhm.
day by day by day, and yet when he died, they had no understanding that he was going to resurrect.
Yes.
The Sadducees,
Mhm.
who didn't believe anything about him, believed that he was going to that he was going to be resurrected.
They actually didn't. What we
But
see.
they put a guard at the tomb because they said,
Right, but remember what they said is that he predicted he would rise,
right,
and so they set the guard to keep the disciples from stealing the body,
And then saying he
and then saying he rose.
resurrected.
okay.
That's why the guard was set in order to prevent
It
their.
wasn't that they believed he was.
No, that wasn't that they believed it.
Okay.
Yeah, they
That
thought he
makes-
was crazy. Yeah.
That makes sense, okay.
Yeah, and I imagine with the disciples, there's this kind of combination of they don't understand yet, but also just the simple brutality of watching someone be crucified can really. I can't imagine how it would shatter your mind
Absolutely.
about the person that you looked up to and saw in all this way. And of course, remember, the prediction would be that what they had in their heads was that Messiah was going to come and lead us. Well, or at least, again, this is more modern scholarship, but it's very good scholarship. That they were waiting for more than one Messiah.
More than one.
Yes, because they were waiting for one to fulfill each of the three great roles. So we talk about Christ as prophet, priest, and king. This is why John the Baptist's disciples come to him and say, "Are you the one we're waiting for, or are we waiting for another?" They're not asking, "Are you the Messiah?" They're asking, "Are you the prophet Messiah, or the priest Messiah, or the king Messiah?"
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, well, at least priest and king. Prophet, they're not so sure about, but the priest Messiah and the king Messiah were two things they were waiting for. So many, again, I mean, you say the Jews of Jesus' day, that's like saying the Protestants of today. There's like a bazillion types of us. But certainly a large segment of Judaism was waiting for not just a king Messiah who was going to lead them to political victory and restore Israel as a world power. Remember, Israel thought of itself as a world power. From a standpoint of, if you study ancient Near East history, Israel's a bit player. I mean, it's tiny in terms of, it doesn't have, and it had a non-expansionist policy. They were not allowed to conquer their neighbors for those purposes of gaining land or treasure. They weren't allowed to go to war. God told them that. They're allowed to protect themselves. They're given the land they're on at the beginning to take away from the giant clans. They're told that they can do that, but they cannot expand. The Assyrians and the Persians and the Egyptians, none of them had those rules. I mean, this is from a standpoint of like modern politics. Israel's like Taiwan caught between China and America.
Yeah.
Okay, who's going to protect us? Who's going to, that's all that kind of, which is partly why Solomon enters into bad political treaties, as does King Josiah later, and Ahab, especially King Ahab. He enters into all these bad political treaties that involve them worshiping other gods so they can have the protection of a client state. They become the client state, of like Assyria or Babylon or whatever. So that's why, I mean, they're tiny, they're terrified, they're hidden, and God's answer is them, "Trust me. Don't worry, I can protect you." And he does when they're faithful, and when they're unfaithful, he says, "Well, if you're going to be unfaithful, you're going to see what happens if you try to trust in your own wisdom to do this thing." So yeah, but that's why they actually have the guards posted to prevent there being a false thing. Does that make sense?
Understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, but now I have,
Mhm.
okay, so we have Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not allowed to expand,
Yes,
but they have to protect themselves from the enemies.
they can.
So they march into those other nations and wipe out everybody.
They don't.
They don't.
No.
That-
Once
that was
the
part of it.
land is established, once you get to the
Okay.
Book of Judges,
Okay.
they've taken over the land. In fact, they don't even do that completely. That's one of the things. If you've done the Bethel Bible series, one of the pictures they show is they're standing sort of over a map of the land, and you see problems. You see like thunder clouds in the distance, and it represents 3 of the groups they never actually drove out of the land that they were supposed to. And that, so they essentially left a fifth column inside of the land. They were to drive those cultures out. They were to utterly destroy them. Doesn't necessarily mean to kill everybody. It means to destroy it so it can't recreate it. No, there's no more worship of those false gods. No more cult where you get giants. No more any of that stuff. All that stuff is what's supposed to be ended, and they actually don't fully do that, which is one of the problems. Becomes like a week inside, week out, right? They're not allowed to expand. They're not allowed to engage in wars of conquest to gain more territory, which is partly why Solomon with his appetite screws things up, because he wants to be rich and important. Well, the only way he can do it is in trade and in taxing his people, so he overtaxes the people in order to look really important, because he can't go conquer another country to do that. So yeah, it's kind of ugly that yeah, Jewish history is not pretty. Any prettier than the rest of history, right? Just human beings making mistakes over and over. All right, so let's jump in. I had us in 37 in case we wanted to review it. Let me pull up 39. Chapter 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate, which basically meant he got to pick his menu every day. So, any comments, any thoughts that you're reading it?
How did his, okay,
Mm-hmm.
it said that he could see that God was with him. How?
Well, he could see that everything Joseph did prospered. It all went
That's what it
well.
was.
Yeah. Yeah, he could see that as he put Joseph in charge of, probably when Joseph arrived, he's the new slave, mop the floor, whatever, do the sloppiest jobs. And when he sees that he does them well, you give him a little more responsibilities. What he saw was that everything he was giving to him went well. And this would have included, as he rose in the ranks of somebody as this important, he would have had lots of servants. He would have had a whole staff of servants. So if you watch any of those upstairs, downstairs shows, like I enjoy, we're watching that, what's that called, the Golden Age right now. I should say we've watched it. We're current, but now Ian's home where he's watching it to catch up. But that's set in America, New York City, during the Industrial Revolution. So you see these people with unbelievable amounts of wealth, names we know today like Rockefeller and things like this. You see these people building the great trains and the subways and the bridges, and they have unbelievable. Well, they have a full staff. They've got 20 servants in their house. Well, as you go up in rank, you've got not just 10 people running the kitchen, but you've got someone in charge of the kitchen, and then they've got someone over them, like the head butler. That's why it's always the butler did it, right, in the mysteries, right? Because they're in charge of the whole staff.
Right.
These people are the footmen. These people are doing that job. These people are doing that job, and that was they had all control of the household in that way. So this would be the equivalent, and of course in America in this period it was really the husband was going off and running the corporation, and the wife was in charge. So she would be the equivalent of Potiphar, with her lead butler being in charge of the house. And so he basically rises in his master's esteem by doing everything he does with excellence. And it also, as he raises to be able to in charge of more of them, it means he's good at organizing too. Because it's not just that he does his personal work well, but that whatever rest of the staff he's put in charge of, they do their work better because he's in charge.
Right.
So you're seeing this we're being clued into by the author in an indirect way how good he is at organizing. This seems to be a gift God has given him, and and here's the key piece: God is blessing the household for Joseph's sake,
Right.
not for Potiphar's sake, but for Joseph's sake. So God's election of Joseph has not been removed just because his worldly circumstances have fallen to pieces. the God who sent these dreams to him, that his brothers would bow down to him, still has his hand on his life, even though he's now a slave, right? And this should bring to our mind echoes of what happens with Abraham, right? Because Abraham is told he will be blessed that he may be a blessing. So ultimately, when the people go back to the land in the story of Joshua, even though they're driving out and destroying these cultures, it will ultimately be a blessing to those people and to the people of the whole earth. Because they're under the thumbs of demons, even though they don't know it. You know, and there's a wonderful historian from England right now, a guy named Tom Holland. He's not a Christian, but he wrote a book called Dominion, which has gotten all kind of interesting reviews, and created lots of controversy. In his estimation, the excuse me, what he's making the case for is that Christianity, and by extension Judaism, has been a blessing to the whole world, even if you're not a Christian. You need to look at what came before Christianity and what Christianity has done to create what we think of as the modern world. And so that's essentially what you're getting here, is that Potiphar is being blessed because Joseph is God's chosen, and he had the brains to buy him. So, but it's not for Potiphar's sake. Potiphar's not being blessed because he's a faithful servant of God or anything like that. It's because God has elected Joseph, and Joseph continues to be faithful, as we'll see when the next paragraph unfolds.
But that makes sense what you said about the book.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity is based on love, and the world is based on hate and fight and
Power.
Power, exactly.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Exactly. And that this is what the case he's making is, like, for instance, what we call human rights is no such thing. It's Christian. It's a completely Christian idea, which is why certain countries still have not signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they know it's Christian and they know it's Western. So China's never signed it because they could read it back when it was authored in the 1940s and go, we don't want any part of that. That's Christian. If you're willing to write something about what Mao did or what Confucius did, maybe, but we're not going to sign something that's based on Christianity. So yeah. All right. Any other comments about that first paragraph? Okay. Moving on to the second half of verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything back from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. Okay. I especially am interested in what the ladies think about this, because I have no insight into female psychology here.
I wish there were more ladies here.
Yeah, exactly. Put less burden on you two. Sorry about that.
She thinks different than I would.
Mm-hmm.
You too.
I'm not,
She thinks different than we would.
definitely.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. You are the product of
Although
Christianity.
I might think he's handsome, and I might,
Uh-huh.
admire that, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Think of it, at that point, the husband was the power and the wife was the household person.
Yeah.
Why would she give up everything that he is giving her for the sake of,
I don't think she's planning to advertise it to her husband.
well, but
I think Joseph is supposed to be the milkman when Potiphar goes to work.
But there is no such thing as a secret. Secrets are always exposed somewhere along the line.
Especially with all the other servants.
Exactly.
They know everything.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. In that show, The Golden Age, one of the ladies in waiting so the lead woman for the wife tries to seduce the husband in one of the scenes, and it's very much a power play. This is her idea. She'll become, though she's going to be illegitimate, she'll have incredible power, not just over the wife and the rest of the staff, as if she has this secret liaison with him, but over him eventually, because then she'll have the secret against him that she could unveil that, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite the game. He actually does what she does and turns her down in the show. But this piece, you're right. Think about that. The man would have been the power in the house. But here's what you need to know: he was probably sleeping regularly with the female servants, and she was fully aware of that, because that would have been part of his rights.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, this continues long into the Christian period, and we know this because we have copies of the sermons Christians preached to their congregations into the 5th and 6th centuries. So Christianity becomes legal around in 320 AD with the Edict of Milan, and then a whole bunch of people suddenly want to become Christians who never were interested before because it was a persecuted religion, right? And you were sort of made fun of. But now the emperor is going to be Christian. Oh, I want to be Christian too. But they don't really want all the things that come with being a Christian. The early Christians put up with a lot, and they were very strong spiritually because of that. They were very disciplined. They learned to master their passions and stuff like this. And you can tell already, 1 Corinthians, right? What is St. Paul is not even a little bit timid about telling them they're 100% out of line with certain behaviors, including sexual behaviors. He's very, very clear. In fact, he says one guy needs to be kicked out of the congregation because of his sexual behavior. He can be readmitted when he repents, but not till then. So we know from our documentation, from those sermons that exist, that pastors spend a lot of time preaching to the male Christians that they shouldn't go home and have sex with their female slaves, or their male slaves for that matter. So all of that is to say, it took a long time for the sexual ethic, such as it was, of the Roman Empire to get destroyed by Christianity. It took centuries. It took about 300 years for Christianity to become legal. It took another 300 for it to get rid of that part of Roman culture. So it took a long time for people for these things to change, and it took consistent work by the church for these things to change. So what's fascinating about this, of course, is that this is all happening before the giving of the Decalogue, before the giving of the Ten Commandments. Okay? And Joseph says, not just how can I betray my master, but how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?
right.
So he has this tremendous moral intuition that you can't. Now we know that we know for sure, because that was the purpose of the last chapter, right, with Judah and Tamar. We know there's sexual ethics that are endemic to that society. They're not outlined for us in a code we can go read. But Judah is considered to be immoral, or he would if he was revealed, right? That's why Tamar plays the trick on him, because he won't give her a son, one of her husband's brothers, to marry, which is what was required.
Right.
So Judah tricks her father-in-law into getting her pregnant, and then when he wants to have her killed for getting pregnant, she says, "Guess how I got pregnant?" kind of thing. So his sin was greater than hers in that case, right?
Right.
And not just the sin in sleeping with her, but the sin in not giving her rights as a wife.
Right.
Her rights as a wife or to a new husband, one of his children. So what we have here is this, we're getting a sort of backdoor insight into these ethics. We know that it was violated regularly, right? We see that. We also see polygamy, right? How many wives does Jacob have? 2 wives and 2 concubines, who are the ladies in waiting to the wives. So remember that competition between the 2 wives of the 2 sisters, who's going to be the favorite wife. I'm going to get my ladies in waiting involved in all of this. I mean, this is just internal warfare between the 2 sisters, but he's got 4. One of the things that the church will point to and say that this is one of the clearest pictures of Christ in the Old Testament is Joseph has 1 wife. He has 1 wife, and he only sleeps with his legal wife. He turns down Potiphar's wife, and doesn't isn't involved sexually with anyone that we know about until he actually gets married and has legitimate children. And this is a picture of Christ is only married to his church. And that comes out of not just the church looking backward, but remember, in between, you've got all the prophets. And one of the most common images that the prophets use to talk about Israel's unfaithfulness is God's faithfulness. He's the faithful husband, and she's the unfaithful wife. The people of Israel is the unfaithful wife. That's the whole book of Hosea. If you want to be glad you're not called to be a prophet, Hosea has to marry a hooker, and every time she has children, and she doesn't give up her profession, she keeps sleeping around, and his whole ministry is to live with this unfaithful woman and say, I'm playing the part of God. And all these children that she's having are just, it's not fair, you know. So he actually has to live it. He doesn't have to talk about how unfaithful Israel is. He has to live it out in front of the people. It's called a prophetic sign act. And a lot of the prophets are called to do that. Like Jeremiah is called to walk around the city of Jerusalem in sackcloth and ashes, right? Which is a symbol of mourning. Why are you mourning? Because Jerusalem has fallen. Are you an idiot? Look around. We're rich. We're well fed. How can you say we've fallen? Nope. He's walking around. Huh?
Just wait.
Just wait. That's exactly right. But he was called to act it out as well as preach it. And a lot of the prophets are called to do that. So.
I think we live in a terrible age.
Yep.
But I don't think I could have lived in that period of time. It just, everything is contrary to what we were brought up with and believed in.
Yeah, well, what the Bible, because you were brought up in a Christian culture, right? You were brought up in a culture that
If
says
you had
these
lived
things are
then,
okay.
you would not.
You wouldn't have thought it was weird.
No.
Which is why our young people are having such a rough time, because they're not being raised in a Christian culture.
Yes.
Because what they're getting, especially through social media, the loudest voices in their ears are not the people we would think of as the ones who were influential. If you look back on your own life and think who was influential to you, not just a pastor, but your favorite coach, or your grandfather, or that favorite uncle, or that guy in the neighborhood who took all the boys out and coached, softball or played. Like we had a guy, he never coached anything, but he was the dad. It turned out, I didn't know this till later, he was out of work. And so all the moms would take us to the local swimming pool, the community swimming pool, and he would go all day long, he'd look for work, and then he'd come out and play with us at the end of the day. Well, he became the guy who would roughhouse with us and throw us around, and the boys all loved that. It was king of the mountain, and he must have gone home exhausted every day on how he dealt with us. But he was so influential at that time in my life on me. They're not getting any of that. They're getting this stuff through their social media feed. And the different apps, which is why they just said TikTok needs to be sold to some corporation not controlled by the CCP, because they're deliberately, it's called demoralizing, quite literally, and it's given that term for a reason. It's taking away the morals of a people so that without morals, our emotional resiliency and our framework collapses, and these kids are having it taken away from them. We've essentially said to our biggest geopolitical enemy, yeah, you talk to our kids, we won't. And so, which is why they just, despite massive opposition from both parties, all the representatives voted to get rid of it because they knew that this was a winning ticket back home. There was almost no votes on either side of the aisle against that, despite the fact that the bigwigs in the parties were telling them they needed to vote against it. You rarely see in this day and age the rank and file go against the party leadership. Well,
Exactly.
because all the big money was saying we want to keep TikTok because they're all wrapped, all the money interests are wrapped up in China right now, so they don't want to have to readjust their businesses and everything else. So that's true of Republicans too, because it was one of their mega donors. I heard that 9 of his $11 billion of his fortune is wrapped up in TikTok. So, yup. So both parties are guilty of it. But that's why you're right. It's very different for these kids. They have no framework at all. I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it. But not only have I had to deal with suicides, but all kind of mental health issues with these kids as I do ministry with teenagers that I never saw 25 years ago. Never saw it. They had more guardrails on their road to keep them safe. Even if they bounced into them and banged back off, there was more to keep them safe. There's less now for these kids because they're entering that world where it's not just post-Christian, but now it's almost anti-Christian.
Yes.
So So they're living in a different world than we grew up in. I didn't come to faith till I was 25, but I benefited from the faith of the people around me because it helped structure my world in really important ways. So, all right. Sorry about that little rabbit trail there. I should get off my soapbox and get back to reading the Bible.
It was relevant.
Yes, it was.
That's good. Anything else you wanted to lift up from these? These 4 verses. 4.5. I thought verse 10 was interesting. Just as she spoke to Joseph day after day, so she was very persistent. This wasn't a once and done thing.
No.
And although it would be several centuries, several thousand, maybe several millennium, till Shakespeare would say it. Now we're going to find out that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." I'll just read a little bit further so we can wrap it. "And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, 'This is the way your servant treated me,' his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison." So I'll end it there. So I just wanted to get to the end of that bit of it. So,
We look at it as a terrible thing, but it's an opening of a door to a new world.
it will be, but that's not evident at this point. You're right. Poor Joseph couldn't have seen it that way. He did the right thing and got punished for it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Nietzsche famously said that it's a horrible thing to punish somebody for their vices, but it's far worse to get punished for your virtues.
Yes.
You know, and I had that experience when I was forced into resignation at my church up in the Poconos. I was the only person in a position to know everything that was going on, but because you've heard of the ethics of the confessional, there are certain things I can't say because they're not. Even if the person's attacking me, I still can't say what I know in confidence from them. And we had these kinds of game playing going on. It was horrible to know I was losing my position because I was doing the right thing. It didn't work. If I'd done the wrong thing, it would have been bad enough. But it's terrible to know you did the right thing and be forced out. So.
I guess they didn't have conscience back then.
No, sure they did. They just ignored it like we do. Lots of people ignore their conscience and do it pretty regularly. And it usually starts small, right? Well, this is just a little infraction. But then you get comfortable with that little infraction. And then you get to the next one's a little bigger, and pretty soon you're not paying any attention to what you know you're supposed to do.
It's okay because my husband does it, so I can do it too, right?
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. In this case, it would have been, because this would have been shameful for her as a woman. If the other women with her rank and status had found out she had done this would have been shameful for her. The other women in the community would have shamed her. It wouldn't have just been a problem for her husband. That would have been a problem internally too. And I don't know Egyptian law. It might have led to her being divorced from him, but certainly it would be a problem for her. It would be a problem for her if she was caught.
Sometimes you wonder why they aren't caught.
Why what?
Why they aren't
Why
caught.
they aren't caught.
They are caught.
In the end, they are.
In the end.
In the end, they
Yes.
are. Yes.
Which is why we look towards that that what is to come is when everything gets set right. Not everything gets set right in this world. What we trust is that God uses the bad stuff, right? That's again, it's become a really powerful verse to me. Maybe just because of that thing that happened to me up in the Poconos, but Romans 8:28, where it says, "All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose." Doesn't mean all things are good. It means that if I stay in my faithfulness to God, He can turn even the worst stuff into something good. If I break away from that, then it's just going to be something bad that happened to me. Now, it's still something bad that happened. God's not the author of evil, but He can turn that evil to something good. Good for me because it'll help save my soul. Maybe I become a blessing to others that I wouldn't have been otherwise. I mean, all that stuff it's just out there. It's that's the reality of that faithfulness kind of thing. So. Other things that grab you from this.
Apparently, whatever her name was, she never was found out about it.
Well, it's interesting. That's a good question. Because his anger is kindled. Potiphar's anger is kindled, but the easiest thing to do with your slave is just kill him.
That's true.
And that would be absolutely justified in the eyes of his of the people of his rank. Why throw him into prison? And it becomes an open question because because later you're going to see Potiphar is going to show up in the story again later, and it's almost like he doesn't believe his wife.
Oh.
It's a very subtle subtext.
And there's a possibility she did it before.
Exactly. You tend to know the person you sleep with pretty well, and I'm guessing that he at least thinks her perfectly capable of this kind of thing. Because it could mean, of course, you get angry right off the bat, and men deal with that Y chromosome thing we have. But he doesn't take what would be the normal action. To throw him in jail isn't what would be socially acceptable and normal in his status. You know.
Oh, God's behind it.
I was going to say,
Yep.
it's probably being
Yep.
controlled by God.
Right.
Because God has other plans.
Yes, and I'm sure that's part of it too. But just from that sort of psychological human perspective, he has literally given he trusts Joseph so much, and Joseph has proven himself so trustworthy that he's in charge of everything in the house. He literally has there's nothing in the house, the way that Joseph says it here in back in the previous paragraph. He is not greater in this house than I am. I mean, that's a strong saying for Joseph to say,
Yeah.
I'm as important
Yeah.
as he is around
Yeah.
here. And he basically says, he's trusted me at this profound level, and that's going to be true. That he would be angry and throw Joseph in prison. They would be angry would just make sense. They chooses to throw Joseph in prison rather than simply execute him, may demonstrate that to himself. There's a scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where the four kids, one of the girls has this experience where she wanders into this mystical world called Narnia by accident. And then the little brat of the four does the same thing but lies about it. Says, oh no, we were just playing a game, and da-da-da-da-da. And of course, the one who went first, she has this emotional reaction to it. She's like, she knows her brother's lying, but she can't prove it to anybody. Well, the two older ones go and talk to the person's house they're staying with, the professor, and say to him, this is this crazy story, and we don't know what to do with our sister. And the professor looks at him and says, which of the two of them would you say is typically the most honest? And they say, well, is your brother more honest? And the older one says, well, this would be the first time. And he says, then why wouldn't you believe your little sister? And so it's kind of like that. This seems crazy, but he knows from his experience which is more trustworthy. Again, if she's willing to practice deceit here, she's probably practiced deceit before And to your point about there being no secrets, gotten caught at it. Right? So he knows his wife isn't trustworthy, and he knows Joseph is.
Right.
And so it seems out of character for Joseph to do this. So either because he had love for Joseph before, and this is like a betrayal, but he can't quite bring himself to execute him, or because he has this suspicion that his wife's not being completely honest, he doesn't opt to execute him on the spot.
But he had to do something.
He had to do something, right?
Yeah.
Because now it's public, right?
Yeah.
Because she has testified to all the male servants of the household
Yeah.
that Joseph did these things, but he has to do something.
He's got it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is interesting because the Old Testament doesn't blush to tell us his anger, like especially about God, his anger was kindled at so-and-so. This just says his anger was kindled. It doesn't say it was kindled at Joseph. It just says his anger was kindled. So is he angry at the situation? Is he angry at his wife? Is he angry at Joseph? It's really hard to tell. It's very, very subtle, and we're in the realms of speculation. But it's worthwhile speculation because he chooses to make this thing. And certainly God's providence is at work in it. But God works through us most of the time, works through means. Doesn't just reach out of heaven and do things. So, yep. Shall we finish till we're this close to the end of the chapter?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, we'll start at verse 20. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
No matter what he does, it's always the right thing because he believes.
Yep. And clearly he's got this gift for organization, but it seems that his greatest gift is his trustworthiness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, his faith. Yep. And of course we think, because we live after the Enlightenment, we think of faith as believing God exists. But the language that the New Testament uses, pisteuos, which is the word for faith, also means faithfulness, trustworthiness. So when we say I have faith in God, we mean I'm betting my life on God. And we say God is faithful, that he means it's the exact same word in reverse. So it's this reciprocal relationship back and forth of trustworthiness. God's always trustworthy. We often are not, but he's forgiving, and for that we're grateful. But what seems to be, even when life is against him, Joseph is absolutely trustworthy, such that he's a prisoner and the guard doesn't worry about him. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah. When you think of prison guards in those days, they were rather cruel people.
People were probably attracted to the job for that. If you had a cruel streak, you were attracted to that kind of job, right?
Exactly, yes.
Mhm. Yep. Okay. Any other comments as we move forward here? All right. Well, this will set the stage for Act 3 of Joseph's life. I've often thought there's probably a novel to be written if we were to rewrite the story of Joseph for modern times. One of my favorite authors, Marilyn Robinson, did a book. I can't remember the name of the book now, but it was essentially King Lear, but it was set on an Iowa farm. The generations and who was going to inherit the farm, but she did it. Basically rewrote King Lear